Welcome to the ArmaniTalks YouTube channel. I'm your host, ArmaniTalks. In this channel, I'm helping you level up your communication skills. If this is your first time on the channel, welcome aboard. What are a few of the communication skills that I'm speaking about in this channel? Public speaking, creative writing, storytelling, and much more. High in-demand soft skills that will make 2021 and forward much easier. To join me for the latest tips, tricks, and insights, be sure to hit that subscribe button right on below. Let's talk about self-sabotage. Dissatisfaction can be one of the greatest things out there because dissatisfaction leads to action. I can testify to this because there was a certain period during my early 20s when I hated public speaking. I didn't like the concept of it at all. But deep inside, there was that urge to know what it felt like to be on stage, to be rocking the mic, and to be getting a round of applause once I was done speaking. Due to this dissatisfaction, I ended up joining 3 Toastmasters clubs. Not 1, not 2, but 3. And these 3 clubs had different members, was in a different location, and gave me different audience members to practice with. One of these clubs I'm going to be zoning in on for today's episode. This club, when I walked in, I immediately started to notice something. What did you notice? What I noticed was that most of the members were seniors. All of them had white hair, and you would expect that this group would be the most low energy one. Right? No, this group was the highest in terms of energy, so much enthusiasm. And for this group, they didn't feel like they had to be in the meeting. They felt as though that they got to be in the meeting. As I joined this club and I started to interact with the different members, eventually I came to understand them on a very personal level. And after talking to a lot of these different members, there were a few more observations that I made. One of the observations was a lot of them used to be shy. This was something that was common among many of the members. And for another observation, a lot of these members spent decade after decade after decade self-sabotaging themselves from coming to the club, from conquering their speech anxiety. And the third observation I made was that due to point 2, the decades of self-sabotaging themselves, point 3 was that was the reason why they're so enthusiastic nowadays. These members, they came a long way in their journey, and that's the reason why these members embraced public speaking. It was a craft of theirs. After being in this club for some time, I was clearly the youngest member. One of these days, there were 2 other guests that came. And these guests caught my eye because they were roughly around my age. I was thinking, are they younger than me? These 2 guests, one's name was Renee, the other's name was Paul, and they were married. You know how married couples, normally they start to act like one another, they start to look like one another? This was not the case for Renee and Paul. Renee, she had this very glowing smile. When you talked to Renee, when you saw her, you could tell that she was a leader. After speaking with her for some time, she actually was a leader. She had many people working underneath her for her business. Paul, on the other hand, did not give you that same vibe. He was someone who had very poor body language. He mumbled a lot. He said a lot. And overall, he was much different than Renee. They ended up coming for the next couple of weeks, just to different meetings. And routinely, Renee would raise her hand, she would give a powerful talk, and she would always live up and exceed expectations. And routinely, Paul would not initially volunteer to participate like Renee. But here was what was unique about Paul. Paul was one of these individuals who, if you gave him a nudge to, like, yo, Paul, how about you volunteer today? If you gave him that little nudge, he would always volunteer. He would never say, no, not today. When we would say, why don't you do it today? Immediately his hand would spring up. And Armani, when his hand sprung up, did he surprise you? Did he end up giving a stellar talk? Not quite. He actually ended up doing very poorly. He would barely finish a 2-minute talk. He would get off the stage in 20 seconds. 10 of those seconds was just him saying, like so. And most of that was just talking in circles. But he would still volunteer. He would never turn down the opportunity when asked. After being in a part of 3 Toastmasters clubs for some time, I eventually came to realize that 3 was too many. I had to chop out 2 and focus more effort on 1. And one of the clubs that I ended up chopping out was the one with the elderly folks and Paul and Renee. I started to zone in on this club for the next couple of years. And one of these days, I had more time. And I was driving right past this old club. I thought I might as well check it out. It's been 2 years since I've been into one of these meetings. Let's see what's changed. As soon as I enter, there's a lot of the same members as before. A lot of things are the same. But one thing shocks me. Paul is now the vice president of this club. And Paul is different. He's speaking clearly. He has nice body language. And he's speaking in a way where he's resembling Renee. And now you could tell that they're a married couple. What was peculiar was that Renee wasn't in the meetings. Renee didn't end up joining. Paul ended up joining, and he ended up rising among the ranks. After that meeting was done, Paul came up to me and was like, yo man, I haven't seen you in 2 years. I'm like, Paul, is this still you? Did you eat Renee or something? You're like a completely different individual. And he was. And as we were talking, he made sure to say thank you. You know, I really want to say thank you to you and a few of the other members who would always encourage me in order to speak. Thanks for that. And as we started to talk further, I asked him, I was like, you know, a lot of these members, they spend decades and decades and decades talking themselves out of speaking. How come you would always volunteer? Even though you weren't good, now with all due respect, you weren't good, how come you would always volunteer? He was silent for a while, and then he gave a very honest response. He said, well, it's because I was embarrassed. I was embarrassed because Renee was showing me up in all parts of life. She was the winner. She was the breadwinner. She was like the good-looking one, and she was this amazing communicator, and I was just behind her on multiple steps for each one. I had to volunteer because she was, and I didn't want to embarrass myself in front of her. This was a very peculiar response because I thought that in terms of overcoming self-sabotage, you had to reason with yourself. You had to do a lot of self-talk, a lot of affirmations. And for Paul, he was just breaking down that myth in context to his life. In terms of Paul, all emotions became needed emotions. Paul, the one that's an amazing speaker, would not exist if he did not have that level of shame of being overshadowed by his wife. And due to Paul's shame and using that emotion to bulldoze into action, where dissatisfaction was the engine regarding action, he saved himself a whole bunch of time. Time that a lot of these other members can never get back. What Paul ended up showing me that day was, in regards to self-sabotage, doing a lot of self-talk can become a form of procrastination. Self-sabotage is something where, even though it may not feel like it, even though it may feel like that the bottom tier emotions, the very dark ones like embarrassment, fear, anxiety, although these are the reasons for self-sabotage, ironically, these are the same emotions which allow you to bulldoze through self-sabotage. Paul, he needed to use that fear to eventually propel himself to new heights. And even though Renee never ended up joining the club because her business started to blossom and it required more of her time, Renee was the top part of that spectrum. She was starting to become that ideal version that Paul could eventually become as well. Once he started to overcome that self-sabotage of him doing poor in terms of public speaking, the sky was the limit. No one would have been able to predict that Paul was eventually going to have a leadership position. He just did not have that spunk in the first couple of meetings. Yet, he developed a spunk because deep inside, whether he was aware of it or not, he understood the psychology regarding self-sabotage. The same emotions that hold us back will eventually be the same emotions which allow us to break through. You can't quite do this with intellect alone. You could even argue that intellect alone will be one of the reasons that you further self-sabotage and then you logic with yourself after. In a situation like this, Paul showed that all emotions become good emotions when all emotions become different layers of the spectrum in regards to energy. There is no action without energy pre-existing it. And in Paul's situation, he eventually proved that he no longer needed to live in his wife's shadow. It's because he had the guts, which ultimately allowed him to develop his public speaking swag. If you want more practical insights on how to overcome your dark emotions and how to leverage it, be sure to join me on my free daily newsletter, which goes out every single day at 7 p.m. I talk about the art of using your emotions rather than being used by it, and finding a way to leverage all forms of the energy to become a much more dynamic, unpredictable, creative communicator. For free daily insights, be sure to subscribe in the pinned comment right on below. And thank you for joining the Armani Talks YouTube channel.